Today we're moving into the Soviet period, and we're going to move through this part relatively quickly because in some of my classes I discuss the politics of the last 100+ years in a lot of detail, and in my other classes a short overview that I offer here is actually more than enough. Now here I will be discussing not so much specific events, but rather the major transition itself from the end of the Imperial Russia to the beginning of an entirely new Soviet system. Now, you remember from the last video that the Bolshevik Revolution, aka the Red Revolution, the Communist Revolution, the October Revolution, happened in 1917, and it was the end of the Russian Empire. And for centuries, Russian society had been built around the authority of the Tsar or Emperor. And throughout those centuries, we repeatedly discussed the same pattern. Ordinary people generally had fewer and fewer freedoms and less power as the time went by. Then suddenly, in 1917, everything changes. The old hierarchy is overturned, and the groups that had traditionally been at the very bottom of society, and that's peasants and workers, are now proclaimed the foundation of the new state. The new government claimed that workers and peasants would now rule society instead of aristocrats and nobles, and for many ordinary people, this felt almost unimaginable. Now, you probably remember the name of the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution who promised all that. That was Vladimir Lenin. And as you can see on the slide, there is another name next to his name. So I want to mention that Lenin and actually Stalin as well were not actually their original last names. Those were their revolutionary pseudonyms, though today we mostly remember them as Lenin and Stalin. So Lenin came from an educated and a relatively privileged background, but he embraced the ideas of Marxism and socialism and eventually communism. He and the Bolshevik Party, which is another name for Lenin's Communist Party, argued that society should be organized around the interests of workers and peasants rather than elites. And I'm kind of simplifying it as always, but yeah, but still. Now, who do you think would oppose that kind of a transformation at the time of the revolution? Of course, the nobility, the aristocracy, the elite groups that had a good life in the Russian Empire. So these people had held political and social power for centuries. And of course, most of them did not accept the destruction of the monarchy and overall the old social hierarchy that the Bolsheviks started. So once the Bolsheviks took power, they launched what became known as the Red Terror. So the new revolutionary government tried to eliminate political opposition or any enemy of the revolution. So large waves of immigration began during this period, and former nobles, officers, intellectuals, and other people escaped to Europe and the United States and other countries just in order to survive. But many stayed and fought against the Bolsheviks. And these anti-Bolshevik forces became known collectively as the White Army, because color white had traditionally been associated with monarchy. The Bolshevik forces became known as the Red Army, and this conflict developed into the Russian Civil War that lasted several years and devastated the territory of the former Russian Empire. Now, one reason the Bolsheviks ultimately won was that they gained significant support from workers and peasants. And of course, they also had access to all of the resources they seized from the empire, but people's support was very important. And as I said, many ordinary people believed that Bolsheviks represented a chance for a completely new social order in which common people would finally matter politically. So naturally, they supported the side that promised them that kind of a power. At the same time, the White Army often struggled to present a clear alternative that could appeal to the population. Because remember earlier, we discussed that the Bolsheviks executed Nicholas II and his family. And that was a big blow to the supporters of the monarchy because they basically had no more ground to stand on. There was no bloodline anymore. Now, the Bolsheviks were trying to make sure there was absolutely no path for the monarchy to return. They wanted to eliminate not only the Romanov bloodline, but also the very idea of monarchy. They just wanted to erase it from people's minds. Now, remember, St. Petersburg had been created by Peter the Great as a symbol of the Russian Empire, and later rulers, especially during the era of the women on the throne, expanded its palaces and luxury to the point when the city itself became strongly associated with imperial Russia and aristocratic culture. So one of the symbolic things that the Bolsheviks did was move the capital back to Moscow. Another major aspect of communist ideology was rejection of traditional religion. The new government promoted atheism and tried to reduce the influence of the Orthodox Church in society. Churches were closed, religious property was confiscated, many clergy members fled the country or were imprisoned, or in some cases even executed. Now, remember something we discussed many times throughout this lecture. Historically, the Russian state and the Orthodox Church had been deeply connected. So, for centuries, the church supported the monarchy and reinforced the legitimacy of the rulers. So, from the Bolshevik perspective, religion was not only a spiritual institution, it was also connected to the old political system that they were trying to destroy. And that's another reason why the Soviet government treated church and religion so harshly once they took power. And the Soviet government did not simply remove religion from public life and just leave an empty space behind. Communist ideology itself now functioned almost like a new religion. So young people especially were encouraged to place faith not in religion, but in socialism, the Communist Party, the communist leaders, and the bright future of the communist society that the government promised to build. And another extremely important part of the Soviet project that I want to mention here was education, because it also brought a lot of support to the Bolshevik Party. One famous revolutionary slogan suggested that even an ordinary cook should be able to govern the state. And the idea behind the slogan was that education and political participation should no longer belong only to elites. Remember that under the empire, literacy, education, and social benefits were a privilege of the elite. Now, the Soviet state promoted mass education and literacy campaigns all across the country, and literacy rates increased dramatically during the Soviet period, and education became accessible for free to millions of people who previously would have never had those opportunities. But again, education became a tool for spreading communist ideology that basically replaced religion, as I said before. So, after the revolution and civil war, Soviet society was not simply trying to create a new government. It was trying to create an entirely new social order, new values, and even a new way of thinking about life itself. And during its first years, the Soviet state was trying to survive and to strengthen itself internally and also internationally. And the new government began building relationships with other socialist and communist movements. And eventually, this system became formally organized as the Soviet Union, which was a union of 15 republics with Russia in the lead. At the same time, major structural changes were taking place inside the Communist Party itself. In 1924, Vladimir Lenin died. And for a couple of years before his death, Lenin had already been seriously sick. And during that time, he became less active politically, so more power gradually shifted toward the leadership circle surrounding him. And of course, after his death, a major power struggle began inside the Communist Party. And out of the struggle, Joseph Stalin, or Iosif Stalin, emerged as the ultimate winner. He became General Secretary of the Communist Party, which in practical terms meant becoming the most powerful figure in the Soviet state. Now, Stalin was very different from Lenin. Lenin was highly charismatic and he really believed in the ideals of the revolution. Stalin was different. He was much more associated with strict control, discipline, and harsh measures. So under Lenin, terror and repression had largely focused on groups associated with the old order or political opposition during the Civil War. And under Stalin, that focus shifted. So by this point, most supporters of the monarchy and all aristocratic order had either fled the country, been defeated in the civil war, imprisoned, or executed. In other words, there were no enemies left. So now the government began searching for enemies of the state inside the Soviet society itself. And if you think back to earlier Russian history, this pattern may sound familiar because we kind of discussed it in the previous videos. In history, several earlier rulers also became deeply suspicious of plots and disloyalty around them. And in many ways, Stalin developed a similar mindset of political paranoia and launched a massive wave of terror against people close to him who he suspected of disloyalty. And then this paranoia and search for the enemies of the state kind of trickled down into every level of the society, and this period became one of the most frightening eras in Soviet history because large numbers of people were arrested, executed, sent to labor camps known as Gulag. And eventually, fear of the state and fear of doing or saying something, anything against the state, became deeply rooted in everyday life and people's mindset. Now, let's step out from the inside situation for a second and look at what's going on in the world. And the world, and especially Europe, is bracing for another potential war. And the Soviet Union was fully unprepared because the country had gone through revolution, civil war, economic collapse, and years of political terror. So Stalin realized that the country is again backwards compared to Western powers. So he decided that rapid industrialization was absolutely necessary if the Soviet Union wanted to survive this future war. And this led to forced industrialization on an enormous scale. Factories expanded rapidly, heavy industry became a priority, military production increased, and entire regions were reorganized economically. And just as we saw earlier, in Russian history, modernization often happened through coercion and state pressure rather than gradual development, and that again was the case here. The Soviet government also carried out large-scale forced resettlements. People were moved across different parts of the Soviet Union for many reasons: political control, labor needs, and access to natural resources. So entire populations were sometimes relocated to support industrial development in remote regions. And you might ask, didn't people protest? They did, but by that time, the terror waves of the previous years scared most people into total submission. Then came World War II. That started in 1939, and the Soviet Union actually joined in 1941 after Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd. And that part of the World War II is referred to in Russian as the Great Patriotic War. For the Soviet Union, the war became absolutely catastrophic. More than 26 million Soviet citizens, both military and civilians, died during the war. Cities were destroyed, infrastructure was destroyed, so many things were destroyed. At the same time, the Soviet Union played one of the central roles in defeating Nazi Germany. The Eastern Front became one of the most brutal and destructive theaters of the entire war. And this experience of World War II, kind of like this mix of sacrifice and glory, would permanently shape Soviet identity and mindset for generations to come. But while the Soviet Union emerged as one of the major powers that helped defeat Nazi Germany, the relations between the Soviet Union and its allies in the war, especially with the United States, became increasingly hostile after the war. And this tension eventually developed into what we call the Cold War. And it's called the Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States, of course, never fought each other in a kind of like full-scale military conflict. Instead, they became global rivals, politically, economically, ideologically, and of course, militarily. And one of other major consequences of the Cold War was increased isolation of the Soviet Union, and it actually was self-imposed. So borders were tightly controlled, there was basically no travel in and out of the country, any communication with the West was limited. Pretty much everything possible was done to restrict foreign influence. Now let's return again to our recurring question. Were the lives of ordinary people becoming better or worse? As you remember, we're talking about good life in terms of personal freedom and liberties. And last time we finally responded better to this question with some restrictions, but still. Now, things changed. After the revolution, the new state needed money, lots of money. And since Russia was still mostly an agricultural country, money came from selling grain. So entire agricultural system was reorganized into collective farms, in Russian kolkhoz. And just like we saw during the imperial times, it was important for the state to control where and how many people are working in these collective farms. So for decades, collective farm workers in the Soviet Union had severe restrictions on internal movement, and they had no access to their own passports. So in practice, that meant that many people who lived in rural areas could not freely relocate whenever they wanted. Now, how about the workers? Remember, there was rapid industrialization before the war, and then the country needed to be rebuilt after it because of so much destruction. And much of this burden fell directly on its own population, with harsh wartime laws with regard to workload requirements and long working hours and punishments for missing work. So, although the Soviet system officially claimed to represent workers and peasants and that they were becoming the new elite, everyday life still involved major limitations on personal freedom. Okay, we will stop here, and in the next lesson, we'll talk about the last decades of the Soviet state and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Thank you.
If you like it, please click like.